Okay, is everybody ready? Yes, good work. Thank you for coming out on this rainy night. I know that isn't an easy thing to do. I'm glad you're all here. This is going to be recorded tonight, so you should be good and ready for the cameras and ready for the audio and ready for everything else. I'm Professor Gina Barreca. I teach in the English department. I have been here since, let's just say, 31 years. Since my entire adult life, I have been at the University of Connecticut, and that gives me the authority to tell you to shut down your devices. I want your phones off, I want your laptops off, I want everybody off, every device. And one of the interesting things about being in front of the room, which you probably know, but maybe not all of your teachers tell you, is that there is no fourth wall in front of a classroom or a teaching situation. So we can actually not only see what everybody's doing, but after 31 years of teaching, I can actually read the thought bubbles over your heads. So it's really, so just turn them down. Don't be looking at your shoes. If I see your hands in your laps, I'm gonna assume you're masturbating because I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. So just turn down your devices, just make sure they're off, don't make me call you out, just make it easier on everybody. Be present, especially for a panel like tonight. We are, he's putting his hands up. We are here to talk about something really important, and it's great if everybody would be sort of eyes up and fully present. That would be a way to honor the distinguished panelists. We have wonderful discussions ahead of us, and I hope that one of the things that you're going to do is to keep in mind, since you won't be able to write them down, the questions that you're going to want to ask during the discussion. Okay? You can write them down if you have like a pen and paper, like if you actually have those antique implements with you, that's fine. That's really, you brought an Etch-a-Sketch, that's good, you can use that. Anything like that would be fine. But think of the questions, think of those questions that you hesitate to ask in other venues, in other circumstances, about loneliness, about connection. When I put up on my Facebook page, on social media, about the fact that there was going to be this discussion tonight, after 31 years, I have thousands, literally thousands of former students, and they were like, why wasn't this going on when I was a student at UConn? And I said, well, this is, now it's sort of officially recognized. Loneliness is gaining recognition. The idea of the need for connection between individuals is sort of coming together as an issue that we need to discuss as a community. And I wrote a piece recently. I'm a columnist for the Harvard Current, and the pieces are syndicated, they go around the country. And I wrote one a couple of months ago on loneliness, and I started it this way. When you're lonely, you feel like, well, the good lives are taken. When there's an invisible and impenetrable distance between you and the world, that's loneliness. The world might appear inviting, but you've been left off the guest list. And I'm the humor lady. Most of my books are funny. Most of the work I do is on humor. A lot of people who consider themselves part of the humor tribe have in fact been profoundly lonely at some point in their lives. But then again, I think most people have been profoundly lonely at some point in their lives. Oddly enough, it's something we don't talk about often unless we're talking about quick fixes for it. When you see lonely stuff, it's usually 5 ways not to be lonely anymore. 5 quick fixes, 5 ways to meet people, 5 that's not how it works. Loneliness isn't something like, eczema, right? It's not something that you can buy something for that you're going to get better right immediately. It's not something that people can see. It's not just an itch. Right? Not that eczema, if there's somebody with bad eczema here, I'm not discounting eczema, there's an affliction, all the rest of it, but there are different ways. Loneliness is something that's an entirely different kind of concept, okay? As my colleague and friend at the UConn School of Nursing, Thomas Long, put it, loneliness has been my constant pale companion, and I'm an extrovert. Tom is adapting a line from Shakespeare's comedy A Midsummer Night's Dream, and when which character tries to banish the pale companion of melancholy from a celebration. I think pale companion works as an image. Loneliness saturated my childhood and seeped into my early 30s. I was abjectly and achingly lonely as a child. It was always worse at dusk and on weekends. I asked people to tell me, I said, when were you most lonely? What was the day of the week? What was the time of day? What was the time of your life? What was the moment when, looking back, you could feel yourself most lonely? And a lot of people were not by themselves when they felt lonely. You could feel lonely at a party. You could feel lonely in the middle of a family celebration. You could feel lonely in a long-term relationship. Lonely doesn't mean you have to be by yourself, and being by yourself doesn't mean that you're lonely. In retrospect, I realized that my mother was depressed. During her own short life, she died when I was a kid. She felt exiled inside my father's large family, separated by a different language and living thousands away from her, miles away from her own family. And so she would talk to us, right? And I learned to be funny and tell stories to my mother to make her feel like she had company. And I think that's what a lot of people learn to do. We learn to have another self that we present to the world. Chris Rock said when you're dating somebody, it takes 3 months for your real self to start dating their real self. Right? For the first 3 months, your fake selves are dating each other, and then, after a few weeks, a long time, you start to actually know who the person is that you're dating. But you learn to protect yourself in order to survive, and usually that means coming up with some kind of mirage, some kind of other self. If you're always dealing with another self, not the real self, if you're an imposter, it makes you feel lonely, even inside your own head. And then you start to doubt the offers of emotional generosity you get from people. When somebody wants to be your friend, then you start to think, well, they don't want to be my real friend because they don't know the real me. If they knew the real me, they would run away, right? So then you all start to second guess yourself, and then you're afraid to actually show who you are, and that leads, I think, to a greater sense of isolation. And I think you folks who deal with social media all the time have an even greater sense of that, or at least it could lead to a greater sense of that. I think that loneliness is not something that needs a quick fix. I think it needs to be discussed, addressed, defined, and dismantled, not just buried. It's too easy to bury it, right? Okay? We always know that choosing solitude is an option, but that's very different from being lonely. But let's be honest. Being lonely can be really a kind of hell. Yet loneliness is a fragile hell, and it's one that goes up into smoke when somebody sees us, the real us, recognizes us, and welcomes us. So what can we do? They're not quick fixes, but they're possibilities. You send a note, right? You pick up the phone, the actual phone, like with a voice. You pick up a phone and you talk to somebody. I had a student come in not that long ago, and he said, I actually had a conversation with that girl I've been seeing. And I said, what do you mean? You've been going over to this girl's room every week? He's a kid I know well. And he said, yeah, but we talked on the phone. And I said, but you've been exclusive, right? And he said, yeah, but we had a long phone conversation. And I'm like, boy, things are different, right? So that having a phone conversation with somebody is now a level of intimacy that other kinds of activity that were once considered more intimate don't reach. But you have to figure out what that is. So picking up the phone, hearing somebody's voice, wave hello. I say hello to students on campus, even when I'm just passing them in the hall. I say, hi, how you doing? And so people, they look around to see who I'm talking to. We'll be alone, 2 people in the hall. They're looking around to see who I'm saying hello to. It's like you, I'm saying hello to you. Saying hello to each other is a great thing. It's nice. You look up, you make eye contact. It's you that somebody's saying hello to. Saying hello. The worst thing that happens is if somebody doesn't say hello back, what you realize is that you haven't made a mistake. You've made a really good beginning. We take somebody's hand. We look somebody in the eyes. We say, how you doing today? Right? We can banish the pale companion. We can do something about this. But it's going to take us as a community being able to discuss it to begin to make that happen. Now let me introduce the panelists. I'm so glad to be in the company of these people this evening. The first one we have, right here, I just had a nice cup of coffee with, Julianne Holt-Lunstead. Dr. Julianne Holt-Lunstead is somebody whose work I've been following for years. She's a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University in Utah. She just flew in from London last night to talk to you. This is somebody who flew in from London to speak to you tonight. You gotta ask good questions so we look good, okay? We have to look good from somebody who's been awake for 4 days to get here. She was speaking to the Ministry of Loneliness, which is now something that's been established in England because they've recognized the profound effect that loneliness has on the lives of human beings. Dr. Hope Lundsted's research is focused on the long-term health effects of social connection. Her work has been seminal in the recognition of social isolation and loneliness as risk factors for early mortality. Dr. Holt Lundstedt has worked with government organizations aimed at addressing this issue and provided expert recommendations for the U.S. Surgeon General's Emotional Well-Being in America initiative, and is currently a member of the technical working group for the UK Cross-Departmental Loneliness Team. She serves as scientific advisor for the Australian Coalition to End Loneliness, the Foundation for Art Healing, and the Research Advisory Panel for the ARP Services, Inc. and United Healthcare. Her work has been highlighted in the BBC 100 Breakthrough Health Discoveries in 2015, has been covered in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Scientific America, This American Life, The Today Show, and every other major media outpost that you could think of. Alondra Marmologos. Say it again, entirely wrong.
Alondra Marmolejos.
Alondra Malamarjos.
Marmolejos.
Marmolejos. No.
Marmolejos.
This wonderful woman here is a senior at UConn, and I apologize for not getting your name right. Double majoring in speech language, hearing sciences, and psychology. She is a research assistant at the SLHS lab and is a member of the Early Detection of Autism Psych Clinic on campus. She volunteers with America Reads, teaching ESL local elementary schools, which is fabulous, and is a student ambassador for Narrative 4, an organization which uses storytelling to spread empathy. Derek Pan is a junior majoring in molecular cell biology and minoring in psychological sciences. He aspires to one day become a physician and an advocate for public health policy, terrific, with a focus on mental health and wellness. At UConn, he chairs the Student Services Committee at USG, is president of Huskies for Haiti, the Education and Development Chair of the Active Minds, and the co-fundraising chair of UConn Archery. I used to know the coach, the student coach for UConn Archery. Betsy Kracko, Dr. Betsy Kracko has been the director of UConn's Counseling and Mental Health Services since 2013. She's somebody whose name you should remember and somebody you should get to know. Betsy is a great, Dr. Kracko is a great resource on our campus. Before coming to CMHS, she worked with the UConn Women's Center's Violence Against Women Prevention Program. Dr. Kracko received her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the College of Holy Cross, a Master of Arts in Counseling Psychology from Boston College, and a PhD in Counseling Psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In addition to being a licensed clinical psychologist, she's also a certified yoga instructor and meditation enthusiast. Good resource on campus. Now we will begin with Dr. Julianne Holt Lundstedt. Again, it's an honor to have her here. Give her an appropriate welcome. Thank you. Behind the podium, this is what, yeah? You can hear me. So, Julian, as we were talking about over coffee earlier, you have been one of the, obviously we can see, one of the major researchers in this field. The idea of defining loneliness, which people see as sort of general, vague, isn't this just part of one of those eternal things that everybody has to go through? When did you first start to see it as a scientist, as a researcher, as a problem that actually has an effect on the way people live their lives and an effect on the rates of mortality? I believe in your research that you said, or the data that you gathered, that it was the equivalent of obesity, the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes, was it a day? 15 cigarettes a day, that's social isolation. It was the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That this has an effect on your health and well-being that will lower not only the quality of your life, but how long you live your life, that is commensurate with other health problems that have long been recognized as as terrible issues that the country and that health providers need to deal with directly, but has only recently come under the aegis of a real concern for the culture. How did you get the idea to do this?
So I actually started out, well, I'm a health psychologist, and I was doing laboratory-based studies where I would bring people into the lab. I'm half laughing because it sounds terrible, but it's really not as bad as it sounds. And we would hook them up to physiological equipment and then stress them out. And many studies were students, but some of them were older adults from the community. And so we would do a variety of things, but the point was that we wanted to see how people react physiologically in these kinds of situations, and always part of that was the influence of social relationships. So from study to study, it might have varied. The effect of social support, we would find that people would have a blunted stress response, meaning normally we would see these massive spikes in blood pressure and heart rate when people were undergoing these stressor tasks. But when there was either social support present or perceived to be available, or they had more social support in their networks, they didn't show this kind of response, even if they weren't even there. And so there was always this underlying assumption that this is giving a snapshot into how our body responds on a chronic basis, and that this in turn influences physical health. So I was aware of studies around the effects of being socially connected or lacking social connections and mortality, but apparently the rest of the world wasn't aware of this. It seemed as though it was, me and a small group of academics, and so that's where I really started thinking, okay, well, I'm aware of the evidence, maybe I need to summarize this.
And about what year was this? How long ago?
So
Not as old as me.
I started working on this in 2001. So it's been a while, yeah. And so it was in 2010 that I published my meta-analysis, this synthesis of all this data on this that found the link to, or established the magnitude of this effect. And so it's, it's interesting because I think one of the things that you point to also is there seems to be a little bit more interest or awareness around it more recently, and what is that all about, and why now? And of course I can't say for sure it's this, but let me give you some possible reasons, or at least ones that people have thought of. The first is kind of just that it's been a lag. So sadly, the New England Journal of Medicine published a review that found that from research to implementation in medicine, it takes an average of 17 years. So part of it might be the lag, although I'm not sure where this falls because it hasn't quite been 17 years since my meta-analysis, but it's been a lot longer than 17 years since the first study, so either we're way behind or we're a little bit ahead of schedule. But nonetheless, it could just be that it takes time for awareness to come around. Another possible explanation is that there is of course the role of technology, and that with recent increases in technology, that may be really getting people thinking about this, because it is dramatically changing the way in which we communicate socially. So whether for good or for bad, I don't think anyone can deny that, as you were saying, who picks up the phone and actually talks on the phone anymore? It really is changing the way in which we're communicating. That's not to say that it could be better, it could be worse, it could be neutral, just different. But we don't have enough data that really establishes that. And I can talk more about that if we have questions about the role of technology, and I can tell you what some of the data says. But needless to say, we don't have enough evidence right now to know the exact effect of it. And of course, technologies are so diverse that it's really hard to say lump them all together. But of course, there's also because we think of technology as being like texting and Facebook and social media, but even just the way in which we now have these awesome technologies that can do all sorts of fantastic things that make tasks so efficient that we may not necessarily have to rely on other people as much. And so that may be part of that. Another potential factor is changing demographics. So we do have very clear evidence that there is been increases in the number of people living alone, fewer people are getting married, fewer people are having children, fewer people are involved in religion, fewer people are volunteering, and there's data now that shows that the majority of Americans no longer participate in social groups. So that may be part of it. Another potential factor is economic changes. And part of this may be due to the focus on success. And there's such a, and particularly a cultural drive around being successful. And that it's almost a badge of honor to say, I work 80 hours a week, or that you've gotten hardly any sleep, or that we somehow think that working a lot is something to brag about, or that being busy, life is just crazy busy, right? That we may have less time to really devote to our friends and our family, because we're focused on, I've got to do well in school, I've got to get get this promotion at my job, or whatever that might be. That you have to do all the extracurriculars to have the perfect resume, right? That we are valuing success almost above our relationships. And so, it's hard to say whether, one of these is having more of an effect than another, or it's a combination of all of these things, and there may certainly be others that I'm not even addressing. But here, those are just a few that, we can certainly discuss more.
Right. I was wondering, in terms of students and what younger people are thinking, and what I'm hearing from students all the time, is the sense of that if you want to have friends, that if you're somebody who says, no, I like being around people all the time, I really like company, that somehow there's something wrong with you. That being intellectual, especially, and being successful, and being driven, and being ambitious, means being a loner. I will have students lined up outside my classroom, and mind you, I'm in the basement of the Austin building next to the soda machine and the bathroom. So there, it's it's busy in there anyway. But I have students lining up outside the door going, I just can't be friends, especially a lot of young women, a lot of girls, and they're like, I can't be friends with other girls. My friends are all guys. And it's really like, other girls, they're just so frivolous. They're not interested in the same things. Guys can understand me. I grew up with brothers. It's really these other girls are like that. I said, can you talk to the other 29 girls who are standing outside my door saying they can't really be friends with girls? And then a lot of the young men will come in. It's like this guy culture, this bro culture. I'm not interested in it. Women, I think it's like, here are the other guys who are standing out there. It's as if there's some kind of badge of honor in not being like other people, as opposed to recognize that we're all more alike than we are different. And that as opposed to being part of a community, you have to compete against your community in order to distinguish yourself. And so that you're not working together, you're working against. And that the only way to be successful in a group is to distinguish yourself from that group. And so you have to be the loner, the outsider. Everybody's an outlier. Everybody is supposed to say, no, actually, I like company. I like hanging around with other people. I like a good game of whatever. It's like, no, I'm a loner. It's like, I don't know. Is that really what everybody needs to be, is a loner? Every hero in every movie is a loner and a leader, but everybody's a loner. I just want to see people have breakfast together. And that's the happy ending of the movie, is people are having breakfast together and talking. That's it, that's what I want, breakfast together, nobody's worried about, what they're eating, it's breakfast together. They're saying to the person serving, man, have a second cup of coffee, because we're having such a good time. I don't know, Maybe just,
yeah, and I think actually Alondra's story speaks a little bit to this idea of finding ways to connect with students. So I wonder if she wants, I know she prepared some remarks, so if she wants to speak a little bit. And the other thing I would just throw in is that I know your research is focused on health psychology, and one of those points of data is longevity, but that longevity argument doesn't, I'm estimating, doesn't resonate a ton with 18 to 24-year-olds, and that is the demographic that suffers, or is most likely to suffer, from loneliness. And so to make the argument for college students, what does it sound like around loneliness is a problem, and we should take steps to intervene and alleviate that.
Yeah, so real quick, I'll just, for younger adults, there was a recent Cigna survey that showed that 18 to 24-year-olds have the highest prevalence of loneliness. And I think this is often associated with older adults. And so, all of you are young and I assume presumably relatively healthy. And one of the things to keep in mind is this is just like any other lifestyle factor where your everyday behaviors and actions have a cumulative effect over time on your health. So just like your diet, your exercise, whether you smoke, you're not going to see the effects probably tomorrow or next week. This is something that happens cumulatively over time. However, one thing that's interesting to think about is that there's some data that shows that chronic levels of loneliness are associated with inflammation. And many of our chronic illnesses are inflammatory related, as well as physical illnesses, but also like depression is inflammatory related as well. And so I think it will actually be interesting to see if we are going to, given the prevalence rates among younger adults, if we're going to start seeing chronic illnesses creeping up at earlier ages than we have in the past.
Speak to any of that or yeah.
Hi.
Just say anything.
Okay.
No, she is.
Well, my name is Alondra Marmolejos, and I want to do something I'm gonna exchange a story to you about a time in my life, the most recent time in my life that I felt, thank you, sorry, I'm tiny, that I felt lonely, and I wanna do it narrative 4 style. Narrative 4, as mentioned before, is a organization that spreads rapid empathy through storytelling. And so I'm just going to start off by saying, hi, my name is Alondra, and this is the most recent time that I felt lonely. I want to do a little backstory to start off. I moved a couple times when I was 8 years old, and finally ended up in Newtown, Connecticut with my family. And I was bullied consistently. Why? Because I was a chocolate sprinkle in a sea of vanilla ice cream. That's how I like to mention it. But I was bullied because I looked different, I acted differently, and I sounded a little different. I had a little Spanish accent. And growing up in Newtown, I used every year that I had there to build myself and to make myself more presentable and to make myself love myself more in order to fit in. Once I decided that if I didn't accept myself, nobody else was going to accept me, I started really becoming who I am today. Newtown became who I am in a sense. So on January 10th of this past year, I unfortunately lost myself because I, in a sense, lost Newtown, because my family and we lost our house to a fire. And this forced us to move to a completely different area and not be a part of the community that I once loved and the house that I grew up in. And to me, that's my hometown. I was there since I was 8. I'm 21 now, so it's 13 years of love, life, memories, and it was the greatest experience to be in that house. However, once we lost it, I genuinely felt like I lost myself. And going to school, starting my spring semester less than a week later, I instantly felt like I needed to drop out. I didn't want to be in school because I wanted to be with my family. I knew what was important to me, and to me at that point, it was my family and not school. I stayed in school because my parents forced me, and that's okay. But they didn't want me to stop, and I'm really happy that they pushed me to keep going because I'm happy where I am right now. But through that process, being in school, I felt very alone. Even though I had friends who supported me, who were there for me, they didn't understand the situation I was going through. At least I didn't feel like they did. And I would go home every single Friday, come back Monday morning, and be with my family at the hotel until we were able to get a townhouse, and that's where we are still living to this day. But as months went on, although obviously my family and I went through the same situation, I felt like I was alone at home because I felt stuck in this rut of this happened to me, this is who I am, I'm not happy, I'm not content. Whereas it seemed that my family was more resilient than I was. My siblings seemed to be able to get through school and do well and continue on with their lives, and my parents were able to put all the stress aside and continue providing for our family, and yet there I was stuck, skipping class, not caring, not wanting to be there. And it wasn't until April where Narrative 4 came to UConn and I was able to speak and exchange my story with my partner. And she was able to tell my story through her eyes. So what Narrative 4 is, it's we get a partner and we exchange stories with our partner. Then we go back to a room where other people have done the same thing, and my partner exchanges my story. So she started off by saying, "Hi, my name is Alondra, and this is a timeline." She told my story through her eyes, and I told hers. Through that, I started seeing that it was okay, and I started seeing the positives out of what I felt were only negatives. The positives, my family, we all survived. It could have been a lot worse. We're still united. Home isn't a structure. Home is where you feel the most content, the most comfortable, the happiest, whether that's with your family, whether that's with your friends, whether that is alone. But you have to feel comfortable and safe. And what I want to tell everyone here today is if you have a story that you want to be and want to be heard, tell your story. If you don't feel comfortable because you don't have a friend, I want to tell you here that, well, one, I'm Alondra. I am a daughter, a sister, a student. But right here, right now, I want to be your friend. And if you need somebody to talk to and to exchange your story with and be in the same vulnerable position, I'm very willing to do that because everybody deserves to be heard. So that's basically it. Okay. Well, thank you.
Hey guys, I'm Derek. I have a short script prepared, so this will probably be like a different style than what Alondra just kind of presented. It's going to be just about my experiences with loneliness and my perspective on loneliness in general as a student leader at UConn. So, as Huskies, we're blessed with being part of such a large and diverse community of over 32,000 students. But ask yourselves this: how easy is it for us students to get lost in such a vast campus? It's no wonder that we college students feel lonely. I can speak for myself. As an out-of-state student from California, my first phases of college life was initially one of excitement and anticipation for a bright new future. Then I realized how easy it was for me to get lost in the crowd of thousands of students. Even as I surrounded myself with new acquaintances, added new friends on Facebook, and joined new clubs, I still felt like an outsider and constantly felt lonely. It seemed like everybody on campus I knew came with friends from their hometowns, while I had to open up and try to create new friendships. I was a brand new Husky who felt like he was howling alone. Even if you're not an out-of-state student, I'm sure that you can most definitely identify with my experience to some degree. I'm sure that many of my fellow Huskies have felt lonely and isolated during this supposedly bright and promising phase of our lives. Our culture of technology is not helping either. While as a whole humanity is more connected than ever, there has never been a more lonely time to be human. We see what our friends are up to via Snapchat, but we do not take part in these activities ourselves. We chat online but rarely have the time or energy to hold a conversation with those around us. FOMO, or fear of missing out, which is something that I personally struggle with, is a big source of social anxiety. Social media played a very unique role in my experience as an out-of-state student. While it is an indispensable tool for me to keep in contact with friends at home, it also had the effect of making me feel very isolated here at UConn. When pretty much half your social interactions are tagging your friends in dog memes and catching up on your friends' lives via Instagram, you are bound to feel some sort of loneliness. But what are the implications of feeling lonely? As a pre-medical student, are there any pre-meds out there? Cool. As a pre-medical student, I was very interested in learning more about the pathology of loneliness. After doing some research online, I found out that loneliness is a big contributing factor for various illnesses and physical ailments. I also interviewed my fellow Huskies, some of which are in the crowd today, about their experiences with loneliness. And I found one common thread: that the mental health and overall wellness of my peers was being negatively affected by this problem. In fact, many experts point to loneliness as a key risk factor to look for in social anxiety, depression, and suicide ideation. So how do we address such a serious problem that loneliness plays such a big part in? And are we consigned into a future of increasing isolation as our technological advances progress? As chairman of the Student Service Committee and as someone who has experienced loneliness myself, I asked myself these questions this past summer in an effort to find answers. I came to the conclusion that a dual-pronged approach of awareness efforts and a formalized peer support network was the best way to foster a sense of community and connection here at UConn to address the mental health issues that loneliness brings. I hope that UConn students can try to take decisive action to help solve this problem of loneliness at the grassroots level. As future leaders in healthcare, public policy, and academia, we students need to start here and now at UConn. My vision is to create a campus community in which loneliness's negative effects on mental health and wellness is addressed through awareness as well as the establishment of a strong campus-wide peer support system so that no Husky should ever howl alone. Thank you.
So I think we made a great decision in asking student voices to be a prominent part of this panel because you two are incredibly powerful, and thank you for your time and effort that you put into sharing with us. So at Counseling and Mental Health, we're thinking a lot about loneliness. The loneliness scores over the last several semesters, according to the American College Health Association, are increasing among college students, and over 50% say that they suffer from loneliness on a college campus, including UConn. So Juliana talked today in her noontime talk about a pyramid from the CDC, and that population level interventions are often much more effective and impactful than individualized interventions. And even though at Counseling and Mental Health we do individualized interventions, we're also obviously very invested in the population at large and the mental health of the population. I think, I've been involved with Narrative 4. There's a particular author, Elizabeth Lesser, who wrote a book called Broken Open. And she talks about something called the Big Open Secret. And the Big Open Secret is really that everybody has their stuff that they're not talking to everybody else about, sort of to your point, Gina. Whatever mechanisms we can set up, and I think we almost have to structure them because naturally speaking, it's too much of a leap for any of us as individuals to say, hey, let me talk to you in this way about my big open secret. It's not socially what we're trained to do. And Alondra and I were just having a conversation before the talk saying, so we've been trained in this way of communicating, narrative 4 style, deep meaning, empathy, and we start doing that with people and they look at us like, okay, it takes a little bit of getting used to, but if we set up the parameters for it, it's deeply healing. I've never seen it not work. I've never seen it not work. It's so powerful to see the connections happen. We just took a group of students on a retreat that was a digital detox, primarily because phones don't work out in the Berkshires, but it was intentionally a digital detox. And the number one piece of feedback we got from the students, and Mia was with us on that trip, hi Mia, was that I looked around. I noticed coming back to campus more now, the leaves on the trees and the other people. And I have a fuller experience because of my ability to look up. And in fact, our slogan last year for Suicide Prevention Week was look up for that very reason. The year before that, it was love is listening. Connection is prevention. And this year, what's your story? So you get what we're driving at. Finding ways for students to tell their stories and to connect with one another, because when you heard Alondra's story about feeling alone because there was a significant trauma and everybody else looks like they're having an amazing life, you probably identified with that and thought, okay, I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one who has suffered a significant loss. And that's what happens in therapy, it's what happens in group therapy, but if you're having those feelings, it is not a pathology. It is being human. We just try and glossify it all. And I think that's the particular vulnerability of this particular population that we're working with, but all of us glossify, right? I wanted to just share from you a few excerpts. Whenever I need to give a talk, I run down to the Swing Journal, which, listen, the journal is still there even if the tree is dying. For a page from 10/5/18, that was last week, I believe, says, I'm lonely, college is super depressing, a freshman, right? I gotta get better at being me. I gotta get better at everything. I think I've had the worst weekend I've had in a year, but I'm glad everyone else seems to be doing well, right? I want to find that happiness. Everything feels hard. But if anyone else needs it, this is a sign to keep trying and not give up. So students are generally very encouraging, but this idea that everybody else has got it great. And how about the heartbreak that happens when you're in college and beyond college that we don't talk about? So the anonymity, I think, of the Swing Journal allows people to say things. The last day I saw you in JFK, you said you would pick me up when you come back, but you didn't. We had good memories. You didn't even say goodbye to me. You just disappeared like a ghost. Coward. How many of you have felt that before? Maybe you didn't get left high and dry at JFK, but everybody can identify with being ghosted, right? And so I think we need to find and provide ways for students to connect, whether that's through your peer groups. Do you have student organizations that have meetings where we just rattle through an agenda, everyone sits and listens, and then they go? Or do you do an exercise where you give students an opportunity to connect? Those are the small pieces that create a mentally healthy campus and mentally healthy students and a vibrancy that allows us, I think, to learn. I do think that there is something to the technology piece. I thank you taking a page out of your book, and I do not allow technology in my class. And we had a discussion about that. How do you use your phone? Well, I use it during the 4 or 5 minutes where I arrive to class, and it's awkward, and so I get on my phone and check social media or whatever I do. How many of you do that in the minutes before the class begins? Okay, there's pretty much all of you do it, right? Because the idea of what we would do instead has never existed for folks who have always had that technology. And one of my students asked me today, well, what used to happen when you were in school back in the old days? And I said, we used to talk. Or read the newspaper. But we would talk, and so how can we all contribute to that idea of not just self-soothing, that small anxiety that comes up with that? And I have a whole other piece I'm thinking about around addiction and how addiction models really, when we get uncomfortable and then we maybe alleviate that discomfort with that hit on social media. I mean, the research is showing that's a hit of dopamine that we take in. And then we just keep reinforcing that, it becomes difficult to not be uncomfortable when we are alone. So our perception of loneliness, I think, is shifting as well. But, you know, I think any thoughts that you all have on any of the student commentary or that. Also, I just put in employment counseling and mental health. We're around the 4th floor of Arjona. You know how to reach us, look us up on the web. Thanks, my staff is cheering in the back. And so, because they have no business. But thoughts that you may have and questions from the audience at this point.
I'll open it up and I'll be happy to field the questions from folks, but I think that one of the opposite, I'm trying to think of what the opposite of loneliness is. And I think it's curiosity.
Yeah.
I don't think it's being in company. Connection is part of it. But if you're really curious about something, I think it's hard to be lonely. It's sort of like you're not just looking for an answer, but you're thinking about something. You're wondering about something. If you're wondering about something, if the real estate in your head is filled with a thought or an idea, it's hard to feel lonely because you're engaged in something. You're on an adventure inside your own head. And I think like the idea, because again, in my classes, no one can use an electronic device. And so they're all out, they're down, they're not possible. And they're talking to each other before I come into the classroom. I'm always the last one in the classroom, so I'll close the door after me, no one can come in late. And I know I'm not filling my room for next semester, but that is how it works. And they all learn each other's names. There are 22 people in my class this semester. They all know each other's names because they're speaking to each other. So they say, well, I disagree with Jessica because Jessica is talking about this, and they look down at the book. It has to be a paper book. And they're responding to each other, but they learn to be curious about each other. They make connections between each other. And they wonder about each other. And they start to, there's something there that engages them because I really think it's because they're sitting in the same place, and that's what people, just as you said, people used to talk to each other. That's what they used to do. They used to smoke and drink and other things that we don't talk about. That's the other thing people used to do with their hands. Not during class. I'm older than you. Yeah, they used to do that. But those are not habits that anyone's going to pick up. But talking to each other again, that would be something to do.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts that I had around this was also just the stigma around loneliness. And so there's a researcher by the name of Cassio. He did a lot of research on loneliness, and he wrote a book on loneliness. And I recall him telling a story about how he had his book with him on an airplane, and he put the book jacket away because he was embarrassed because he didn't want anyone to think he was lonely. And it was in that moment that he realized like how stigmatizing that can be, and that we don't want to admit that we're lonely because it feels like we're a social failure, and that can be a real stumbling block. But I can also tell you from a researcher standpoint, you know, I mentioned that 18 to 24-year-olds have the highest prevalence rates, but when you look at how it's measured and how it affects risk, it's on a continuum. Every single one of us, including myself, every one of us, we're all on that continuum. This applies to everyone. There's not one single person that this does not apply to. And so if we can help recognize that we're not alone, I think that's one important step to really address this and helping us all.
So when I was going through like the beginning days, weeks after the fire and coming back to campus, I remember just being so emotional walking to class and thinking, nobody knows what happened to me. Nobody knows what I went through. I can just keep going on and nobody would know. The only way people may know is because the clothes on my back smell a little bit smoky. But other than that, nobody would know that this happened to me, and I don't have to tell people. And once I started realizing that I was trying to hide myself from the fact that it happened, and I was embarrassed that it happened, I started realizing there are so many people that we never talk to, that don't open up to us, that are going through similar situations, or even small situations, whatever it may be, but we don't know, and yet we still go on through our lives talking badly about people, or comparing ourselves, or always trying to one-up somebody. And yet we don't know their backstory, we don't know what's going on. So a big thing about what was said before is saying hello. That is huge, absolutely huge. But yet, even though I strongly believe in it, there are definitely times where I don't do it. And there are times where it's easier to look on your phone while you're waiting for your friend than it is to just stop and look around you and see if there's somebody who needs you, if there's somebody that you could say hello to, if there's somebody that you can invite to sit with you in the library, in the union, in the quad, whatever it may be. But this is where a lot of depression and loneliness starts out, especially in elementary schools or in preschools, when you're sitting alone with Play-Doh or whatever it may be because nobody wants to play with you. And then that continues on here now in college and even in the workforce. People isolate themselves. And then, at the end of the day, it isn't fair. It isn't fair, and yes, like, this is your life that you're living your own individual lives, but if we each have a little bit of empathy within us to stop and think, the person next to me is also a human being, the person next to me may also be suffering, the person next to me may need a kind hello. Something super simple, I think would be extremely beneficial to us, to an individual, to our friends, to our colleagues, to whoever it may be, and to teach that to everyone.
I think too, this is where structural interventions come into place. So we can ask any individual to do that, and you might take it upon yourself to do that. But there are schools, particularly high schools, that have started campaigns, No One Dines Alone and the like, which is the most prominent student leaders taking up a pledge collectively to say we are starting an effort on campus to go sit with the folks who are sitting alone in the dining hall in an effort to bring them into the community. And so I think that organizations like USG and the Mental Health Subcommittee who are interested in peer interventions, those are the kinds of things when sanctioned from above have even more impact. And what we're talking about here is community and cultural change, right? So.
I'd like to add a little bit more on that and like the whole societal stigma on loneliness. I'd say like the first step in like addressing loneliness as a society is to just like admit that it's real. Like there's a loneliness epidemic throughout society, and it's costing this nation a lot of problems. It's causing the citizens a lot of it's harming the well-being of citizens, and also we can just look at a good example of how other nations are like other societies are tackling the problems of loneliness. One example is the UK. You just came back from the UK. Earlier last year, or earlier this year, they appointed a loneliness minister. She was meeting with the loneliness minister. So this just goes to show how they're taking this very, very seriously, And I think we in the U.S. should probably take this seriously as well, like from the ground up, like grassroots all the way up to like the U.S. government. And only once we start admitting that there is a problem, that there is a loneliness epidemic, then we can start implementing new ways to address this issue. But I think at first it starts with awareness and even just admitting that it is a big problem.
So I think we want to take some questions from you.
Okay, now it's up to you. What kinds of questions? Go on. Somebody start. Great, yes.
Hi, I was at your presentation earlier today, and one of the things that I was thinking about all through the presentation is that dealing with loneliness as a public health issue, I imagine must be somewhat different than dealing with other public health issues. And although nothing is totally solo, I imagine if I'm trying to get people to stop smoking, it's my personal behavior that is involved with stopping smoking. Or if I want to make different food choices. Now I understand there's other things like socioeconomic status and food deserts and those type of things. But when you're talking about combating loneliness, it's not just one person that can do it, because if we're talking about social connection, social isolation, somebody has to want to interact with me. So how does that change the way we look at it from a public health perspective when it's not, when one individual cannot just choose in the same way to just stop smoking? Does that make sense?
Can I ask you just to clarify something about that?
Sure.
I think that's a really interesting question. So what's the connection between the sort of sense of the community, which is what everybody's been talking about, and the personal? So how does an individual who wants that kind of support, I think that's what you're asking? Tell me your name.
Karen.
Karen? So
I guess I was thinking about it in terms of like, when I think about my mom, who's an empty nester, who might be lonely once my dad passed away, well, she can be encouraged to go to the senior center and get involved with a line dancing group. And, so those are those social structures that we're talking about. And then I think of my son on the spectrum who has social difficulties that are not uncommon with folks on the spectrum, which we know there are more and more of them. So like, what are the things? It's a different structure, right? I mean, you can't just say, okay, here's what we're going to do for you to go find structure. Like, people have to want to interact with him. So what does he need to learn to be more accessible to others? What do other people need to learn to be able to be ready to receive people who think and act differently than they do? Like, I mean, do you understand what I'm saying? It feels like it's different than have your food plate lined up like this, or stop smoking, or
right, because it depends more heavily on the community. Maybe Betsy, you want to
Yeah,
take that one?
you know, I would say in some ways, and you have some thoughts on this too, maybe it's not so different, Karen, that, you know, in order to eat healthfully, you have to have the healthful choices available to you and the places to go get them at an affordable price, et cetera. You know, I'll use this retreat we just did with 20-ish students, and students who I think were more introverted, or you know, international students who are only here for a semester, in different aspects that may have them feeling less socially connected on campus, or some factors that we know might be correlated with some isolation. You're going to pair and share now. You're going to do, you know, and I know that doesn't mean that we can always be there structuring things, but once there's that experience of positivity around the connection in a structured way, would they be more likely and willing to do it outside of that? Now, I think we still have the issue of, yeah, in the natural setting, are people quite that willing to, you know, share in that way? I don't think they are. We have a long way to go.
And I think it's about taking that risk. It's really hard when you, I mean, it is about risk. You have to, it's putting yourself out there. It's, I mean, you were brave enough, Karen, to ask the first question. But it's taking that risk, it's saying something, it's allowing, you know, it's sort of being empathetic, it's being generous, it's being brave at all those times when you're not feeling like you have any of that. And so I think it's drawing on resources that are very difficult to find when you're feeling particularly vulnerable. And that only once you take those steps, though, you in a way find the resources are there that may have been dormant for a long time. And maybe not, maybe you need that help to get them. I hope that's at least a start. We can talk about that after. But thank you for starting to the discussion. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So, you can say, in order to feel, no, in order to tell the story of the loneliness, you have to perceive your loneliness. And what if somebody just pick up their phone and refuse to perceive the loneliness? The loneliness is still there. I listened to your lecture this morning. You said that the loneliness is like hungry. It's like a hunger. You have to eat food to satisfy your stomach, and you can't just ignore and ugly. You can't just ignore the loneliness. How can we? If somebody just refuses to admit they are lonely, how can we make some say?
Yeah. So for those of you who weren't at my lecture today, let me tell you a little bit more about what he meant by that. So what I was suggesting is that there are many from a variety of disciplines that have argued that social connection is a biological, fundamental human need. And that loneliness is kind of like hunger and thirst. It's much like, you know, thirst is this biological drive that motivates us to drink water. That loneliness is the biological drive that motivates us to reconnect. And so I think your question was, what if someone doesn't realize this, and how do we help that person? And so one of the things that typically loneliness is defined as this really uncomfortable, distressing state, the feeling of alone, or that discrepancy between one's desired and actual level of connection. And so typically people who are lonely are going to be more motivated, but someone can be isolated and not motivated. And importantly, they carry equivalent risks. So it could be that someone is very isolated, but may not feel that level of loneliness. And so how do we reach out to those people? And you know, it's interesting because one of the things that is quite common among people who are lonely is what's referred to by scientists as a negative cognitive bias. So what this means is that in ambiguous social situations, there's this tendency to interpret it, be more likely to interpret it in negative ways. So this, for example, let's say someone, you text them and they don't text you back right away. So a negative cognitive bias would be to instantly assume they're avoiding you, they're snubbing you, these kinds of things. Whereas it could be that they are in class, they're busy, or they're in your class and they're not allowed to have their technology, or they're in a place where they don't have that signal. Or they're in the car and they shouldn't be on their phone. So it's hard to know, right? But we need to resist this tendency to assume that, because what the research has also shown is that when there's this negative cognitive bias, that when you assume that someone is hostile or unfriendly, you may act in ways that then makes it awkward for them, which then, of course, is reinforcing, that then becomes somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so one of the ways in which we can focus this, which also gets back to, I think, Karen's question, is from an individual perspective, we can start working on reframing how we think about our social situations. So that's something we can do as individuals. For the rest of us, it might be when we're feeling awkward at that party and we feel like, oh my gosh, everybody else is probably here with friends, I don't have anyone to talk to, maybe I'll just get on my phone, or maybe I'll leave. Instead, look for who here might need a friend. Who isn't with someone else? Let me find the person that might be able to, or might really need someone to talk to. By doing that, it also helps relieve our own feelings of vulnerability. And it's also through those small moments of connections that we were mentioning that can be these small kinds of steps. Of course, it's going to be important to have these structural supports, whether it be the university or the government or kind of national level, but ultimately it's up to each one of us and our communities to really take this seriously and make these kinds of efforts. Yeah.
To answer like kind of both of those questions from like a societal standpoint, like from a public health standpoint, we can kind of look at how UK is kind of tackling. I keep like bringing it up, but it's a really good example. We can kind of look at how UK is tackling loneliness. They have a very like robust system with many different facets to try to address loneliness. First is like a very strong PR campaign to spread awareness and advocacy. So like people that might not know that they're at risk for loneliness can be more aware of risk factors of loneliness. Second, establishing like support structures, pillars of support, networks and stuff like that, programs, resources that you can offer your citizens that seek out those that are more isolated. So for example, I read something online saying how a lot of like the fire departments in the UK, they not only inspect households for like fire safety, but they also inspect households for risk factors of loneliness and isolation, social isolation. And then once they do identify that that household is at risk for isolation, then they are able to ask these households whether or not they would want, they actually have systems where people come and check up on them like frequently or periodically. Also, like, another example is they have something called the Silver Line hotline, which is basically like a hotline that's geared specifically towards like the elderly, because the elderly, they are socially or physically not as mobile, so it causes them to become more socially isolated, and because of that, this thing was created in order to provide that kind of social support and the social contact that they do need. So there are many ways that societies can help their citizens like realize their loneliness, and also seek out risk factors of like isolation to address this problem. Yeah.
Thank you. No, it's a great answer, and it's a great question. Tell me your name.
Adam.
Adam?
Adam.
Adam, but I'm just going to ask again, as I did, is it that you're worried that somebody doesn't understand that that other person is lonely, and you're trying to get them to understand that they're in an isolated?
Sure, I think my roommate is lonely since he just talk with his cell phone.
Your roommate just talks to the cell phone.
I really want to talk with him. And
Yeah.
But he
And well, sometimes roommate situations could be a whole other, I mean, that's like could get its own panel and, United Nations chapter for roommates. But the one thing that I think would be, that I have found in the most basic way, is that for somebody who's difficult to talk to, and might not himself or herself know that he or she is isolated, is that you ask them, not if they want to be helped, you ask them for help. If he's good at something, ask him like, can you help me do this thing? That sometimes people, they could feel like they could justify being a company if they could be of use. Like, so that somebody says, would you help me with this project? Would you help me do this? I'm trying to do something. And they might like somehow justify their existence by being able to help. And it sometimes lets people who are nervous about making other kinds of connections feel like they could do it. But the roommate thing is tough. That's a whole other thing. You're very nice to ask. I think we're done with questions, or one more question?
We're done. Erin's in charge here.
Erin?
We're running a little low on time.
We're running a little low on time.
Yeah, so we have a really quick question. Short.
Not for pressure. Yes?
Hi,
Hi.
My
Tell me
name
your
is-
name.
my name is Reva.
Reva?
Yeah. So I've dealt with similar situations of people being depressed, so I feel like that goes right along with them being lonely as well. And I know there's a lot of like institutions and social structures that can help get them out of that. My question was kind of, how can you get them just out of bed and wanting to do more work? I also attended the African American panel that I think, you had it like a week ago. And they shared like some really deep stories, like personal stories about like their own life. Like one girl, she had tried to come in and she had made it all the way to speaking on the panel and telling us about it. So how can you make somebody go from just lying in bed all day to like wanting to get better and being able to talk to others?
I think, yeah, go ahead, take it.
No, if you were pulling it, did you have?
Short thought, but I think it has to do with consistency and continue to, like, at first they most likely will not agree to do anything with you, but the more you ask, will you, and make, since they're isolating themselves, asking them to go into like a group of people is probably not the best idea, but if it's like a one-on-one, will you come to the dining hall with me and have dinner, or do you want to do like a movie night in the room, or if you're trying to like get them out of bed in general, I would start small within the actual room itself, like trying to see if they would do like a movie night, or like maybe like a spa day. I used to do that with my roommates, and that was always like really fun. Or once they start getting comfortable with that, then I think it would be easier to actually get them out of the room, but you have to have them to have comfort within their actual space first. And if they already have that, then that's a great time to start asking different questions, but try to have it one-on-one, because I feel like that's when people are more comfortable, and then as it progresses, to add more people. But
I'm saving a job for Alondra in 7 years from now. But so, you were at the panel, and so you know all the crisis resources should you hear anything about safety. But we talk about it at Counseling and Mental Health that folks even get so far as meeting with us, and still the kind of movement that we'd like to see doesn't happen. Sometimes it's the 6th try or the 7th try, and it's the analogy I use is loosening the lid on the jar, right? So you may have loosened it up a little bit with your help and your interventions and your spa day, and then the next person comes along, the next person, and finally the 7th try is the one that makes the difference. And I bet if we were able to go back to the students on that panel, they'd be able to list off the first 4 people or 5 people or 6 people or 20 people that made a difference, but didn't see the final product that you saw on that panel. So be the person that just helps loosen that lid a little bit.
And to let everybody know that there are days when it's a huge accomplishment to get out of bed, take a shower, and show up. That there are some days when you're going to win an award, and you're going to come in first, and you're going to come up with the smartest answer. And there are other days that when you get up, get yourself clean, and get yourself to where you're supposed to be, that is a great accomplishment. And that everybody needs to know that that works too. I'd like you to have the last word on this, please.
A lot of pressure. Yeah, in fact, so I just met with the Minister of Loneliness a couple days ago, and I said to her, you realize that how incredible this position is, and the rest of the world is looking to you as a model. And her response was, I know, it's a lot of pressure. She says, I hope, and this is her English, or British, she says, I hope I don't cock it up. And so, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of unknowns still. I think we aren't quite sure how to fully address this. And I think that's why we're all here today, because we want the answers, right? And, but I think there's this, if we can all recognize that we're in this together, that can hopefully be a comfort that we're all trying. We're all doing our best. And as was talked about, we never know who around us is hurting. And that we need to open up and be willing to be vulnerable with each other. And that through this, we can start to loosen that jar, right? And that it probably won't happen right away. And that's okay, because we know that it's coming.
Thank you. Can we have a round of applause? Thank you very much for being here. I hope if you have questions, you'll get in touch with the people who are here, and that you'll come to other events. Thank you very much indeed. You can take out your devices again.